proceeds of sale. Now, just to give you a bit of a background on Cirrus, really who we are, what we do, and why we can put on today's webinar for you. We are a healthcare and dental specialized tenant representation firm. Our core focus is assisting those of you on today's call and many others across the country in your lease agreement. And we are entirely specific to healthcare and dentistry. Now, back in 1994, we were founded by dentists for dentists under the realization that many landlords and many brokers were taking advantage of the lack of knowledge and lack of business intuition that dentists do have. They were forcing you to get the deal done and sign the lease on the back of the broker's car without really taking into account what you were signing and what terms and conditions were following along with those lease agreements you were signing. Now, to this day, 26 years later, we have successfully negotiated over 12,000 dental office lease agreements. And that number is across the country. That's all of the United States and through parts of Canada as well. Now, what makes us unique as a firm, and really being the only one of our kind, is the fact that we keep everything in-house. We have our own in-house legal and leasing team. Those are the ones that take a look at the lease, negotiate the leases on your behalf, while the leasing team takes a look into the market. Are you overpaying, underpaying a rent? If so, by how much? And really effectively allowing us to negotiate the financial component of your lease agreement as well. And additionally, we have our consulting department, which I myself am part of. We focus on educating those of you and dentists across the country on your dental office lease agreements and really helping provide a strategy for the upcoming negotiations. Now, annually, we represent over 500 doctors throughout North America through their dental office lease agreements. And in addition to that, we also deliver about 100 different continuing education accredited seminars. Now, obviously, before the course of the pandemic, we were doing all of our seminars in person, which I wish I was doing with all of you on today's call as well. But in addition to that, we also do put on these webinars. Now, of course, we also lecture at some of the major dental conventions as well, the Greater New York, the Pacific Dental Conference, the Yankee Dental Conference, and the California Dental Association. These are just some, to name a few, but we also do attend many others. Now, what's the purpose of today's webinar? We want to discuss the current landlord and tenant relationship. How has that relationship changed over the course of the pandemic? What impacts has the pandemic had? And what are we looking to do now as leverage? Next, we want to go through the importance of the dental office lease agreement. What makes the dental office lease so different than any other commercial tenancy and commercial lease agreement? Then we're also going to go through some landlord negotiation strategies, which we want to give you some practical feedback and knowledge here today that we can take and move forward with. And through that, we're also going to be discussing the key terms and conditions within your office lease agreement. So going through some of them, identifying what they mean, what type of impacts they can have on the practice, and of course, how they should be structured moving forward. And quickly, I just want to go through some of the market trends that we're seeing today over the course of the pandemic and really how they've fluctuated. So as we can see here, we're seeing a large increase in the vacancy rates, meaning that, and as many of you on today's call must have expected, looking around in your buildings, is that there are people leaving the spaces. Tenancies are unfortunately failing and they have to move out. So we're seeing that occur here on this graph, which is taking place in Charlotte. Additionally, we're also seeing a decrease in some of the rental rates. Not a major one, as some may have predicted, but definitely a decrease nonetheless. Now here we're seeing a very similar trend within Fayetteville as well. And Greensboro is actually having an adverse relationship and prediction moving forward, is that we have seen, we're going to see an increase in some of those vacancies, but that is going to drop off relatively quickly. So taking advantage of the leverage within Greensboro now is a key strategy and key point moving forward. So here's very similar trends across the state and in some of these major cities. Now, to kick off here with really the core focus of our conversations in our webinar today, really, what is a lease agreement? Now, this is one of my favorite questions when I'm running my in-person seminars, and I always go around the room. Unfortunately, we don't have the ability to do that here today. But the most common answer that I receive is a legally binding document of terms and conditions. And that's absolutely correct. And we're looking at 20 to 50 plus pages of legally binding terms and conditions. Now, an additional way that you should look at the lease, and I always advise to look at the lease, is as this: a check. It's going to be the most expensive check that you'll ever write in your professional career. Now, many of you may think, and usually the answer to my question when I ask, what's the largest investment that you'll make in your life? Many say their house. And now for those that aren't a dentist, that is absolutely the case. However, as a dentist, given the large build-out expense and the term, usually on average 20 to 30 years within the same space, this will be the largest single expenditure you make in your life. Now, when you're signing a check and spending money, generally you want to know all of the additional aspects that come along with that. What are the hooks? What are the strings attached to this check? Now, unfortunately, many of you, yourselves and your colleagues, do not look at the additional 50 plus pages sitting below the check that you have just signed. So why is the dental office lease so important, especially during COVID-19? First of all, the office location is the foundation of your practice. You cannot operate your business without your location. While many other businesses over the course of the pandemic are learning that they can in fact work from home or operate from other locations, they realize they do not necessarily need a physical office location. We, however, do understand through being a dentist, you cannot operate without your office. This really is the crux of your business. Now, an ongoing trend, and through, as Eric mentioned earlier today, I've been speaking with hundreds and hundreds of doctors over the course of the pandemic. And now, unfortunately, a very common theme between yourselves and your colleagues is that, well, we're not in the space, so we're not going to be paying rent. I cannot tell you strongly enough how catastrophic this can be to your business. If any of you on today's call have not paid your rent or did not pay your rent over the course of the pandemic and did not come to some form of an agreement with your landlord, you could currently be in default of your lease. So very important that over the course of the pandemic, you have paid your rents, you've paid in full, and if the landlord has agreed to some other form of compensation, whether that be a deferment or an abatement of rent, or some free rent, that you have that notice in writing. But I cannot stress enough today how catastrophic not paying your rent can be to your business. Next, we want to talk about why, as I mentioned, is it so important? Why is the office lease for a dentist so important? You have the most expensive investment and cost to build within your practice. The dental office is the most expensive business in commercial real estate. Now, once you have made that commitment and invested that money into the space, that money has been invested for good. Now, if you decided to move or relocate, how hard would that be? Well, the answer is very, very difficult. Not only from the investment standpoint, but also from time. Generally, on average, we're seeing that in order to relocate a dental practice, it takes anywhere between 18 and 24 months. So we're not like the local law firm or the Subway sandwiches where it's lights off in one location and we move down the road. We are in the space for a long haul, and it does take a great deal of time to leave. Now, but what comes along with that time, an important aspect that is generally overlooked, is patient attrition. Now, regardless of if you're moving a mile down the road or 5 miles down the road, losing patients when relocating is a very, very real problem. So if we are to move, whatever that strategy looks like, we need to make sure that it's as smooth and seamless as possible. And we want to make sure that the lease agreement has been structured properly so we have that long haul. We have that foreseeability and structure, which I'll go into momentarily as well. Now, an additional aspect that many of you may not have thought of is that for those of you that have answered today's poll, and I know that are looking to sell the practice, what makes you believe that you even have the right to sell your practice? Your dental office lease agreement could in fact be prohibiting that. So without a properly structured lease in place, with some significant time and runway for yourself, you may not in fact have the right to sell your practice. And that could be devastating to any long-term plans, any retirement income, things of that nature. Very important that the lease is structured so that you can sell your practice and you're not left in the lurch. Now, from the standpoint and through the lens of COVID-19, your dental office lease gives you extremely significant leverage. Right? While landlords, and as we recall the vacancy and the market trends that I had pulled up just earlier, while landlords are losing tenants and starting to lose money, you as a dental office are becoming the new anchor tenant within the building. They know that you cannot leave and that you need your physical location. But don't be fooled. You are also the best tenant that a landlord can ask for. You have very low default rates. You're a high-class tenant. And this gives you a significant amount of leverage, especially through the COVID-19 pandemic. Landlords know that they need and they want to keep you. Now, with all that information of why the lease is so important, next we need to discuss what, in fact, should your lease be doing for you. First and foremost, it should be providing fair and affordable financial terms. Now, you may recall from that 85% that many of you are, in fact, overpaying in your rent. Now, what do I mean by providing fair and affordable financial terms? We need to look at two key factors, both your internal fees versus your external fees. For example, what do I produce? What is my overhead? What are my annual expenditures? What do those numbers look like? And then on the adverse side, we look at what are the asking rates? What are similar properties in my market going for, in my area going for? How much wiggle room do we have? Are we overpaying? Are we underpaying? And can I afford that? It's a big question. We need to make sure that with our internal versus our external fees, we can in fact afford the rent that we're paying today. Now, an additional financial aspect is the common area maintenance fees. What are you paying in addition to your base rents? Many of you are overpaying in your common area maintenance fees, and landlords are passing along charges to operate their building that they should in fact not be passing along. We want to structure the lease agreement so that we have the right to not only secure proper financials, but have the right to audit landlord financials, ensuring that whatever they're charging us for is fair and true. Now, for those of you that have recently built out a practice or built out your practice from scratch when you started, if any of you had received tenant improvement allowances from the landlord, that is not free money. There is a large misconception about tenant improvement allowance, somewhat of a fool's gold, if you will. It's that the landlord is not giving you that money. It is baked back into your rental rate, which means that your rental rate has been inflated. You've paid that tenant improvement allowance back and some year over year. Now, as I mentioned previously, we want to ensure that we have a runway within the space. We have that long-term stability and security. We want to ensure that our lease agreement gives us longevity within the space instead of looking at, are we still going to be here next year, in 5 years? Generally, we recommend about a 10-year term with 2 5-year options. This essentially gives you 20 years worth of predictability within your space. And landlords, especially now more than ever, love long-term stability. It gives them that ability to foresee revenue over the next 10, 15, 20 years, which once again gives you significant leverage, especially over the course of the pandemic now more than ever. Ensuring that we have a long-term lease is not only beneficial for you from a runway standpoint, but from a leverage standpoint as well. Now, for those of you looking to sell the practice, I know there's a number of you on here today, you cannot sell your practice without term on the lease. Many of the major financial institutions, whether it be Bank of America, Wells Fargo, etc., they need at least 10 years of term on the lease agreement in order to finance the loan for the acquisition of the practice. So without that long-term stability within the space, it makes it very difficult to sell the practice. We also want to minimize your risk and exposure through the lease agreement. Now, what do I mean by that? What I mean through this is, if many of you may have signed the lease agreement personally. So where it states tenant on your lease agreement today, it has your name, Dr. Joe Smith, DDS, an individual. That means for the landlord is that if there's ever any dispute between yourself and the landlord, if there's any default, through the lease agreement, you have now given the landlord the right to come after you personally, meaning all personal assets, the house, the car, the estate, etc. We want to ensure that we're not leaving ourselves open-ended or exposed through the lease agreement. We also want to maximize our flexibility. Now, meaning that we want to wrap the lease around our lives, not wrap our lives around the lease. We want the lease to work for you and not vice versa. So all of those that are looking to sell, those that are looking to start up your practice, want to ensure that the lease agreement is working with you on your long-term goals and strategies. That 10-year term with 2 5-year options, allowing you to practice for an additional 10 years, but still have that ability to sell as well. Now, for those of you that are starting, giving you as much term and foreseeability within the space. Now, many of you that are owner occupants or those of you that are in single tenancy buildings, we can incorporate aspects into the lease agreement such as a right of first refusal, meaning that maybe one day you can purchase the building, or you're that first person that has the right to propose a price on the building. Or those of you that may want to expand in the future, want to have the lease working for you. Then of course, a common theme that we'll be going over today is enhancing the ability to sell your practice. We want to ensure that we have created an asset with our lease agreement versus the liability that many of you may have today, which unfortunately for many of you may not actually give you the right to sell your practice. We need to dive in and take a look and ensure that the lease agreement does in fact allow us to do so. So what are some aspects to look out for within the lease agreement? So as we can see here, there's a number of different aspects that are within your lease agreement. Now we're only going to be touching on a few today, but just some that I do want to make you aware of. First and foremost, the assignment section, which we will go through. This is really the portion of the lease agreement that dictates how you can sell the practice, to whom you can sell the practice to, and what the landlord's involvement in that practice sale looks like. Demolition. Demolition clause may give the landlord the right, if they so desire, to repurpose the building or redevelop the land, put up condo units, whatever the case may be. The landlord may actually have the right through your lease agreement to terminate the lease and kick you out of the practice. That could be extremely devastating to your business, especially if there's no plans or contingencies put in place. Now, a relocation clause, meaning that the landlord has the right within a certain amount of time to notify you that you're going to be moved from your beautiful corner Keystone location to the basement of the plaza of the medical building. These clauses are extremely detrimental. What happens if you're shut down for 3, 4, 5, 6 months while other dentists are fully up and operating? We go back to that patient attrition, loss of patients, loss of business. Now, the death and disability provision, this is a clause that I put very high importance on, especially in today's uncertainty with the ongoing pandemic. The death and disability clause is really a keystone that gives you additional protections through your lease agreement. One way to think about it almost is it's almost like an insurance policy that you don't pay any premiums on. Now, it's that if anything is to happen to you, whether that be a physical injury, any form of mental incapacitation, where you're no longer able to practice wet finger dentistry, or worst case scenario, you are to pass away, it gives yourself or your estate the right to either A, terminate the lease agreement in its entirety, or B, sell the practice. Now, as you can see here, there's a number of others, but a key one here is on the bottom right, the financial statements. Now, many of you that may have applied for the PPP loans, the EIDL loans, or had reached out to your landlord to request some assistance with the rents, they may have requested your financial statements. If you declined to provide them with that, the landlord may have the right through the lease agreement to put you in default. Now, the first thing we're going to focus on here is option to renew language. This specific language is found in about 90% of leases that I read on a daily basis. So I'm just going to give everybody a quick couple seconds here to read through this. So right within the first line, it states, provided that Dr. Joe Black shall remain as the tenant. The problem here is what this effectively does is it makes the options to renew personal to Dr. Joe Black. So if you were to sell your practice, Dr. Joe Black was to sell his practice, and I was the incoming buyer, I would not have the right to any of those options to renew. Now, as we discussed earlier, all the major financial institutions require 10 years of term in order to finance those loans. If I don't have access to those options to renew, it makes it very difficult, not impossible, to receive that financing. Now, moving forward is that tenant duly and has regularly paid its rent and has performed its covenants and obligations under this lease and has not been in default. Now, as we recall, for any of you that did not pay your rent over the course of the pandemic, if you are in default of the lease agreement today, your remaining options to renew your lease could be null and void, meaning that once you reach your current expiration of the lease, you no longer have the ability to renew the lease agreement, and you can be out on your ear. Now, to the next highlighted section, we see any such renewal shall be on the landlord's then current standard form lease. So if your landlord has changed hands, if they have updated some of their documents, you could then see new clauses entering your lease agreement just for renewing the lease. This can be very detrimental, whether that be the demolition clause, the relocation clause, any number of those that could be detrimental. We want to ensure that we're operating on the same lease for our tenancy. Now, it also states that at a minimum rent to be determined between the landlord and the tenant, but in no event shall it be less than the rent paid in the last year of the original term. Right? Essentially what this is stating is that your rents aren't going to go down. We want to ensure a number of things here, but just realize that the landlord has got you on the hook for rents that will always be, if not the same, increasing, but never less. Now, next, we're going to take a look at the assignment section. Now, as I mentioned, this is the section of the lease agreement that dictates how you can sell the practice, to whom you can sell the practice to, and what the landlord's involvement looks like. Now, it states here that if the tenant should wish to assign or sublet the lease premises, it shall first have received the consent of the landlord. So meaning that if you want to sell your practice, you must first ask the landlord for permission to do so. Now, to make it very clear, this is very common to see within the lease agreement. I'm sure for those of you that are owner occupants and own your building and practice out of it, you want to have that control over who can come into the space, who can leave the space, etc. Now, where the issue lies is that moving down a couple lines, it states that the landlord shall have the option to, 1, approve tenant's request to assign the lease, 2, decline tenant's request to assign the lease, and or 3, to terminate the lease agreement upon the effective date of proposed lease assignment. So just for asking your landlord to sell the practice and assign the lease, they can have the right to terminate your lease agreement. Now, many of you on here today are probably thinking to yourself, why on earth would they do that? And the answer is very simple. They've already found an individual that is interested in this space, i.e. your buyer, and now they can market a fully built out dental practice at a premium and therefore provide that to your incoming buyer. You've already found the interested party. We have a fully built out space, and now they can take more money in rent. Now, The next highlighted portion states that the landlord shall have the right to revise the minimum rent to be paid during the remainder of the term to the greater of the then fair market rent of the lease premises or 15% greater than then current rent. Meaning that you've agreed to everything with your buyer, where he's about to sign on the dotted line. And in the 11th hour, the landlord says, okay, hold on. This is all well and good. I'm okay with you assigning it to Dr. Smith, but I'm going to increase your rents by 15%. Far too often do I see practice sales fall through at the 11th hour because of rental rate interferences from the landlord or last minute interferences from the landlord, essentially pulling the rug out from underneath you during the time of sale. Now, furthermore, should tenant receive from the assignee or subtenant any rental income, cash, goods, or any form of consideration in connection with this lease agreement, then the premises is over and above the current base rental rates payable to landlord in any fiscal year during the term of the lease. What it's stating here, and to cut through the legal jargon of that, is that the landlord has the rights to the sale proceeds, meaning that any value that you receive, any payment you receive for your hard-earned practice, the landlord has the right to request those financials and those finances. Now, finally, notwithstanding the landlord's consent to any assignment or subletting, the tenant shall not be released of its obligations under the lease and shall remain liable for any failure of the tenant or its assignees or subtenants to observe each and every covenant of the lease. So what that means is that now the landlord has granted you consent. They've taken money off of the practice sale from you. And also, you are now held continually liable in conjunction with your buyer and the new tenant. It's like co-signing for your neighbor's kid's car and saying, have fun, good luck, but you're on the hook for all of that. What we want to ensure here is that once you sell the practice and you've walked away, you've retained full value for that practice, and you can retire with peace of mind. And you don't have to think about the lease agreement again, or look over your shoulder and wonder, what if my buyer has now defaulted and the landlord's going to give me a call? Like it says at the top, this is found in 75% of dental office leases that I read on a daily basis. So we've gone through some of those major red flags that may be within your lease. We want to move on to the strategy portion of today's webinar. Now we see here the tenant lease cycle. And a key aspect I want to leave everybody on today's webinar with is that timing is everything. Now, we as a firm always advise to begin the renewal process at least 30 to 24 months prior to the expiration of the lease agreement. Now, the reason that we advise this is simple, that it's purely from a leverage standpoint. As we discussed earlier, it takes a great deal of time and money to relocate the practice. Now, don't be fooled. The landlord is keenly aware of this fact as well. They know that you cannot just pick up and move out of the space today and be in a new space tomorrow. Now, that is why your option to renew deadline is so close to the expiration of the term. Usually it's anywhere between 3 to 6 months prior to the expiration. The landlord knows at that point in time, there is nowhere for you to go. You're going to be locked in again. Now, by beginning the process this early and this far in advance, we get to keep some very important cards close to our chest, ensuring that if we need to play them, we can relocate, we can move. And the landlord has some alarm bells go off in their head when they see the tenant is starting to begin these renegotiations so far in advance. They know that you have that ability. So that's why we always advise that 30 to 24 months prior to the expiration of the lease agreement. Now, why is now so much more different than any other time that we've experienced? Now, for those of you that are looking to renew your lease agreement, we'll discuss the long-term lease renewals are providing key leverage, as I mentioned today. That 10-year term with 2 5-year options really gives you that long-term stability for yourself, but also allowing the landlord to recognize that revenue. And a common trend that we've seen over the past 6 months is that landlords are jumping through hoops in order to secure long-term tenants. Additionally, resetting financials, right? As we looked at those charts and the market trends at the beginning of today's webinar, we see that there are shifts and there are ebbs and flows of the market that are ongoing. It is an unprecedented time to reset those financials, to move forward and discuss bringing our rents back to a fair and equitable rental rate. Now, for those of you on today's webinar that are looking to start up your practice, there are incredible deals going on. The financing, for example, Bank of America, Wells Fargo, you will receive some of the lowest financing in our lifetime. Equipment and supplies. Henry Schein, many of the major dental supply partners are really showing that they care for their clients. They want to ensure that you can afford that new equipment during this time, and there are major incentives coming along with this to help you get set up and start your practice. And now, of course, the landlords, they're desperate to fill those vacancies. Similar to how long-term renewals are showing the landlords jumping through hoops, for those of you coming into this space while landlords are bleeding and losing tenants, for you to come in and state that you really want to become a long-term tenant for them and one of their vacancies is a key leverage standpoint. Now, we have tracked 95 billion square feet. So for those of you on today's call, when we can dive into any market, we take a look at those external versus internal metrics, as I mentioned, tracking over 95 billion square feet, over 4.6 million properties tracked, and 1.5 million verified listings. So we have that ability to take a deep dive in every market and get a key understanding of what the trends are. Are you overpaying or underpaying in rent? If so, by how much? And having the key facts through the negotiations and understanding the true value, not arbitrary numbers. So this is the Cirrus process for winning lease negotiations. As we mentioned, in doing this over 12,000 times successfully, we have boiled the process down to a science. Now, first and foremost, we want to gather all documentation. All the documents, the reports, the lease documents, any amendments, any additional items that may be pertaining to your lease agreement. We gather all of those. Now, next, we identify your practice and career goals. How long do you want to continue practicing for? What do you want the practice to look like? Do we want to bring on associates? Do we want to bring in specialists? There's a number of aspects that we take a look at to help boil down what we really want to do moving forward. Now, next, we review the office lease for risks. We go through a cover to cover read of the lease, knowing exactly what's within and how those various items can affect you. Step 4, we prepare with the market research. So all those properties tracked that I just showed you in the visual, we take a deep dive into your market and we know exactly what's going on around you, what those market trends look like. Are there any vacancies in your building? What are those being listed at? Does your landlord own any other properties? Really understanding all there is to know about your market and utilizing that to our advantage. Now, after we've gone through the first four steps, we go to our fifth, which is our outcome and strategy development. So essentially going through what key focuses do we want to have through our negotiation? What are some of the high, medium, and low priorities that we have? Meaning the high priorities are things we must have to secure a successful lease negotiation, and some of the low priorities, meaning some of the things that we're willing to give up to achieve some of those top line processes. Now, we've gone through 5 full steps of our process, and we still have not done one very important thing, and that's reach out to the landlord. We have now gathered all of our facts, know exactly how we want to move forward, but we did not reach out to the landlord. This is a very common error that we see, is that immediately yourself or your colleagues reach out to the landlord and see what the landlord's willing to give. We want to know exactly what we want to achieve before even picking up that phone or sending that email to the landlord. Now, the first step when we're speaking with the landlord is the lease negotiation of the economic standpoint. So ensuring that we get the best financial deal possible. We want to get that out of the way. We want to get through the nitty-gritty of the money, how much we want to pay through rent, is there any free rent, going through all of those economic negotiations. Now, once we've come to the best possible rental rate, we then move forward to the terms of the lease agreement, going through all the legal terms and provisions, how those look, what impacts do they have, and which ones we decided were the top priorities, negotiating those moving forward. Now, once that's done, we've negotiated the lease agreement, we have our final step, which is the final review and execution. Now, I can't stress the importance of the final review of the lease enough. Far too often do we see landlords try to slip in extra clauses or change some of the language at the last minute prior to you signing it. So we have software that tracks all changes and amendments to those documents when we send it versus what we receive back from the landlord. So we want to make sure that all that hard work we've done in step 1 through 7 stays the same once we've finalized our lease negotiation. And of course, the final process is signing on the dotted line and beginning your tenancy. Now, for those of you in attendance today, we are offering a critical dates and risk analysis. This is normally a $1,495 value, where I'll spend 3 to 4 hours analyzing your lease for traps, and then we will schedule a call to cover you and your vision plan, getting to understand the practice, the traps that we've uncovered through the lease agreement, what those liabilities are, what that looks like, and what impact that may have for you, as well as what the ideal lease should look like for you, that one that really helps facilitate your long-term strategies. And of course, how to negotiate effectively and give you that tactical plan. As I mentioned, this is normally a $1,495 value, but for all of those in attendance today, that will be offered at a complimentary status. For those of you that are interested in that, feel free to give me a call at the number you see there, or send me an email. If anybody has any additional questions or concerns, we'll be here on the end answering some final questions. But thank you everyone for taking this afternoon to learn some more about the dental office lease. And I look forward to speaking with all of you very soon.
Thank you, Matthew. And thank you again, everyone, for attending today. I will add one additional poll, which gives the ability to request a complimentary lease review as well as the local rent rate analysis. So if you've had any questions about what you are obligated to pay, or if you've been driving to work and you counted more than a dozen for lease signs, Definitely, it is worthwhile to get an update for vacancies, rental rates, and others in your specific market. So feel free to just quickly update this poll, as well as when you log out, there'll be a separate section to request the additional review. And we hope today has been helpful. Obviously, these are very unprecedented times, and this is certainly now a component of risk where all the things we thought would never happen to us in our lifetime have now occurred. So no different than looking at structuring your wills and estate planning and helping to foresee future potential risks and traps. I can't stress enough how important it is to at least understand specifically the concerns regarding your lease agreement. And I think the big takeaway from all of this is that you have more leverage than you may know. And the fact that the shift, the balance of power, if you will, right? Let it be through, Charlotte or Fayetteville or anything in between, right? The shift of power is going back to the hands of the tenant. And landlords are fantastic about painting you with the brush to say, you know what? I've got a ton of dentists willing to take over the spot tomorrow. And if you're not interested, have a nice day. However, right, you represent one of the best tenants on the planet. Highest build out costs, lowest default rates, high quality foot traffic, right? As well as the prestige of providing healthcare, right? Oral care and healthcare within their units. So I appreciate all the feedback. I'll keep the polls open for another 30 seconds. But definitely, again, for those of you whose leases are expiring on a month-to-month basis or within the next year, I see there are a number of situations which are urgent. Please denote urgent on the poll, right? And definitely we will be in touch ASAP to schedule that complimentary lease review and rental rate analysis. Perfect. On that note, I'll keep the Q&A section open for another minute, or if there's any additional questions, we're happy to answer those as well. One question here on time. When is the best time to engage the landlord? So great question. As Matthew mentioned, the rule book has changed, right? The typical lease negotiation rule book has changed. Typically it was 24 months. However, we've seen some landlords proactively reach out to us, asking us to help send a proposal to renew the doctor early, which is a whole shift. In some cases now even upwards of 30 months. The short answer is, doctor, is the more time, the more leverage. So, what landlords love to do is to wait until the last possible minute. For those of you that the lease is coming up, especially within the next 12 months, time is certainly of the essence. Landlords will typically wait until after the option to renew deadline has passed, and therefore your remaining options are now null and void. So, hopefully today gives you a little bit of a sense in terms of the other side of the landlord relationship, as we have obviously experts on our team specifically to help the tenant through this process. So you're not alone in this, doctor. We look forward to helping out. Thank you so much for everyone's time and have a great and profitable day. Thank you very much, everybody, and we will see you soon.